Good morning, my name is Gwyneth Sabo, and my research will be on the securitization of Syrian refugees with an interpretivist methodology. So to give a brief outline of my presentation, I'm going to start with a background and what my research question is and how I formed my puzzle, and then I'll move on to explain why I chose interpretivism as my methodology, and then I'll finish by discussing a little bit about my plan for SIS 306 as well as how I will fulfill the requirements for this methodology with the concepts we talked about. And then my last slide is my bibliography. So before I go to the next slide, I'd just like to warn the people who are watching that there is a graphic image that can be a little bit disturbing to viewers. So just to give you a warning when you go into the next slide of my presentation. So a brief background about my research. My question will be what explains the identification of Syrian refugees as security threats, and this originated out of how I noticed two different discourses regarding Syrian refugees and creating two different identities, and thus creating a puzzle which I want to explore deeper with interpretivism. So it started with this text, this image of Aylan Kurdi, who is a Syrian refugee whose family was trying to travel from Turkey to Greece, and they used a raft, and unfortunately that raft capsized, and Aylan Kurdi died. So this is an image that is being used throughout media discourse as well as elite discourse to provoke pity, sympathy, try and hold leaders accountable, and assert that we should be having a greater role in this refugee crisis and how we need to take more action. So there's one discourse, the pity discourse, and then on the other hand there's the security discourse, and I have an image of Donald Trump and Hungarian Prime Minister Orban, who have both discussed, and I have speeches of theirs from Donald Trump saying that Syrian refugees are threats to our quality of life, and also Prime Minister Orban, who's said that they are a brutal threat to Europe. So we have two coexisting discourses giving two identities, and I hope to unpack that with my interpretivist methodology. So why interpretivism? If you guys notice, this is a spread plot of, or a diagram that we saw in class of the Arrow framework, and this is kind of what has inspired the framework for my own research, because I too noticed that there is a pity discourse and a security discourse existing that are giving the same identities to refugees. So I have these flow diagrams where we see pity leads to a victim identity, and then a specific treatment for the women trafficked, as Erido showed us, as well as that security discourse giving them a threatening identity, and then we see that countries and organizations are assessing them as risk and for risk management. So I seek to do the same with my research, and I found that Erido was a great framework. And ultimately the goal is to denaturalize the dominant explanations for Syrian refugee identities. So Cecilia Lynch talked about just finding the implicit within the explicit, and we see that there are these discourses, as I've talked about in my previous slide. We see that there are these discourses, there's obvious texts of this existing, and I would like to unpack that and understand these dominant explanations and how the alternative discourse exists with the dominant. So a couple of concepts we've discussed about interpretivism. We started with trustworthiness, and Shortshay and you now give two considerations for trustworthiness, which is reflexivity or methods for meaning making, and they call it member checking. So understanding the researcher's role in their research, and then as you can see in my second definition of reflexivity, that the researcher really co-constructs the world they are researching and creates that evidence. But trustworthiness really focuses on that member checking, as well as data analysis strategies and techniques. And so I plan on researching the whole playing field with this, and Dr. Shinko, my mentor, recommended that I understand discourse that comes from all people who have an opinion in this issue, and just understanding whether I'll be working at the personal or regional or global level with my research, and how I have and not having more discourse. One of the things I think makes my research strong is that I will have discourse from popular discourse, I'll have media discourse, and elite discourse that'll all reinforce this meaning and the logic of my discourse analysis. So the next aspect will be reflexivity, which refers to, as Shortshay now say, the researcher's active consideration and engagement with sense making and meaning making, and the particular circumstances that might have affected the meaning making of that research the researcher had. And this can be physical location, and I plan on discussing my role and how, for example, growing up in the United States, how I understand the refugee crisis, as well as my point of view as an activist, which we saw one of the other student examples used, that even though they may not have a specific identity that connects to people creating the discourse or people who are left out of the discourse, such as the refugees, that identity still plays a role in meaning making. And then the last three concepts we've discussed with interpretivism, and that's validity, which involves the contextuality of the research. In my context will be the Syrian refugee crisis, which is my temporal context, and then I'll, with a greater understanding of what are the political alliances existing that are affecting potentially the discourses, and getting all of that as a framework for understanding my discourses, and then acknowledging that the concepts that are being created are made in this situation, and finally that causality is constitutive. So over winter break, I plan on expanding my exposure to discourses and symbols, metaphors, texts that I've found, and how potentially people who are spewing security discourse may be using the pity discourse, and how that will work hand in hand. And with the recommendations of my mentor, I have some other readings on how I can understand deconstruction and further my discourse analysis. So thank you for listening.